Everyone, welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's webinar, Women in the Role of Expert Testifiers. My name is Madison Calhoun. I'm the Educational Programming Attorney here at ELI. We are so delighted to see you here today. If you are not familiar with ELI, we are an internationally recognized nonpartisan research, publishing, and education center working to strengthen environmental protection by improving law and governance worldwide. This is an event organized by ELI's Women in Environmental Law and Leadership Initiative, otherwise known as WELL, supports ELI's overarching mission to foster innovative, just, and practical law and policy solutions to enable leaders across borders and sectors to make environmental, economic, and social progress. WELL seeks to support and advance women leadership in the ELI community and in the environmental law and policy field more broadly by offering networking and professional development opportunities. We will drop a link in the chat with more information about WELL if you would like to get involved. We have a great program in store for you today. I want to take a moment to thank our wonderful expert speakers for taking the time out of their busy schedules to join us. Now I will introduce our fantastic moderator. Dr. Kristen Robrock is a senior managing engineer in Exponent's environmental sciences practice. She is an environmental engineer and microbiologist who specializes in biodegradation and the fate and transport of hazardous chemicals in the environment. Kristen's expertise is on emerging contaminants. She is a California licensed civil engineer and provides technical consulting. In addition, she has testified as an expert witness. So I'll hand things over to you, Kristen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madison. So I am excited to present or to introduce our fabulous speakers today. So we have Joey Meldrum, who's a partner at Monshot Meldrum in San Francisco, where she brings a rare combination of legal insight and technical expertise to complex environmental, land use, and natural resource matters. She advises clients across all stages of development, from due diligence and permitting to regulatory compliance and litigation, with a focus on brownfields redevelopment, the California Environmental Quality Act, compliance, and land use entitlements. Uniquely, before entering the legal profession, Joey spent over a decade as a licensed civil engineer and geologist, working on high-profile development and infrastructure projects throughout California. So this prior work as a civil engineer included testimony as an expert witness. Our next speaker is Shannon Lankenow, who's a member of the complex commercial and environmental litigation practices at Latham & Watkins in San Francisco. Shannon is an experienced litigator and has led trial teams tackling a number of environmental issues from product liability to plastic pollution and toxic chemical disposal. She routinely works with expert witnesses to prepare for high-stakes trials. Our third speaker is Shireen Foti, who's a senior associate at Covington in Washington, D.C. Shireen advises clients on a broad array of complex international commercial and investor state arbitrations and non-judicial disputes related to issues of environmental social governance, business and human rights, and corporate social responsibility. She's a dually qualified common law and civil law lawyer with particular experience in European seated arbitrations. Her practice is focused on international commercial and investor state arbitration under a range of arbitral rules and applicable laws, including non-judicial disputes involving issues of human rights and environmental due diligence, global supply chains, and investor obligations. And so to start off our talk today, I was hoping that each one of you might describe your connection with female expert witnesses in your particular line of work, being it trial work or arbitration or city council meetings. And so let's start with you, Shireen.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure and to share the webinar with my co-panelists. So my interaction and exposure to female expert witnesses has been in particular in the international arbitration space, although I've also had some in the litigation space as well. And the primary role that I generally see is having, female expert witnesses draft expert reports and working with members of expert witnesses team to put together the report, whether it's a affirmative report or a responsive report. Sometimes it may be a particular subject matter report that deals with one particular aspect of a case. And then, of course, working with those expert witnesses to prepare for testimony, to prepare them for cross-examination, or in my role as counsel, then to cross-examination and opposing witnesses, party as expert witness. So that's been my primary exposure to them.
All right, thank you, Shireen. Shannon, what has been your experience with female expert witnesses?
Similar to Shireen's experience as a litigator, we are often involving expert witnesses in our cases from the very beginning of litigation, with the ultimate goal of preparing expert witnesses for trial. And but you know, often the relationship starts at the very beginning of the litigation, where we're using and relying on our expert witnesses to really help us develop our entire trial strategy. And, you know, so we work with our expert witnesses very closely to develop motion strategy and discovery strategy, and sort of working through all of the phases of litigation, and then ultimately culminating in trial. And in my personal experience, that is mostly jury trials.
Thank you, Shannon. And Joey, I think you have a little bit of a different perspective, if you could explain that.
I do. So the kind of litigation that I do is it's called writ practice. And so it's all based on the written documents. So the primary interaction I have with expert witnesses or expert consultants is kind of similar actually to Shireen and Shannon. You know, the technical reports that they write are really important. And then also testimony that they give at public hearings that gets transcribed. When it gets to trial, the only thing that the judge is looking at is the written product. So the written technical reports and then the written transcripts of their testimony at trial. So it's kind of similar, but with a little bit of a tweak, because we don't have jury trials and we don't have depositions. And I think those are two of the main pieces that differ between the kind of litigation I do and what Shannon and Shireen do.
All right, thank you. So I have worked as an expert witness. In fact, I had my 9th deposition last week. But I have rarely seen other female experts in the matters that I've worked on. In fact, just a little data point here is that at a recent trial, there were 10 or a dozen or so of us experts, and I was the only woman and the youngest. So I wanted to ask each of you, have you commonly or rarely seen female experts in your line of work? Shannon, if you could start with the litigation realm.
Yeah. So I'm going to probably give a very lawyerly answer here, and say it depends. I think, you know, I've been practicing for almost 12 years now. And I think over the course of my career, the number of female experts that I have worked with has increased significantly over the course of that 12-year career. So in the beginning of my career, I didn't work with very many female experts at all. And now I'm happy to say that, you know, in certain of my cases, we have 50-50 representation between men and women in our expert panels. Sometimes we have a greater number of women as serving as experts than men. So it's sort of changed over time, I think, and it's becoming much more common, I think, now for female experts to sort of be part of the pool of experts that we're interviewing. I also find that, you know, when I'm working on a case with a lot of female attorneys, that becomes sort of, something that female experts is sort of something more routine that we consider, you know, so when we're looking at a pool of experts, you know, we are certainly making sure that we've included all of the well-qualified female experts out there for consideration. And then second, I would just say, you know, it sort of depends on the subject matter that we're dealing with. And I think I still see sort of differentiation there. And in environmental science, you know, in fate and transport and sort of geology in those realms, I tend to see more men, more male expert witnesses. But for instance, in the realm of epidemiology, I tend to see a lot more female expert witnesses. So I think it sort of depends also in the particular area of expertise we're talking about.
That's great to hear that there's a lot more of us. Shireen, what has been your experience in the arbitration world?
Yes, thank you. So, I would say for the majority of my career thus far, I have almost exclusively seen male experts in these, you know, multi-million or sometimes multi-billion-dollar arbitration matters involving companies across the world and sometimes states as well. And you know, the challenge, I've seen more women, of course, appear more recently. There has certainly been like a greater presence of female experts in the arbitration world as of late. And I've had the pleasure of working very closely with several female testifying experts over the past, let's say, 5 years or so. But before then, I didn't, you know, really have much. Almost all of my cases had both male experts, both on our side and on, you know, multiple other parties' sides in the arbitrations that I've been involved in, and that's disappointing. And I don't think it's for lack of available women, because many of those expert witness teams were actually composed quite significantly of women. I worked very closely with a number of women as kind of supporting members of the experts team, oftentimes kind of the right-hand person for the testifying expert. But the one with a great deal of experience, a great deal of testifying experience, happened to be on most occasions the male experts of these various expert firms. So unfortunately, the case has been that we're not seeing a lot of women in the international arbitration world, although I think that's changing, and I can talk a bit later about what some of the statistics show with respect to that.
Thank you, Shireen. So Joey, what has been your experience more in the sort of a city council board meeting
Yeah,
realm?
and I'll kind of echo Shannon in it kind of depends. So in my world, there are environmental consultants who kind of lead the team for environmental review before development projects. So at a national level, that's NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. I primarily deal with CEQA, which is the California Environmental Quality Act. And there are CEQA consultants or NEPA consultants who kind of lead the team of the entire environmental review. And I feel like the majority of consultants that I work with who are those specialties are women. It's still kind of an even split, but there are a lot of women in that field. But when you get down into some of the more technical areas, you know, the transportation engineer, the acoustical experts, and some of the other kind of civil engineering ones as well, it's still primarily men who are the people standing up at the city council meetings and testifying, even though sometimes the team also is composed of women. But I don't think it's not as stark maybe as what you're seeing, Kristen, in the expert testifying world. I think there are a good number of women in my world in that.
But as your experience as a civil engineer previously, because was that a more male-dominated space, and so the other experts that you were working with or against, were those predominantly male or a mix, or what was it?
Predominantly male. It's a very big difference. So as Kristen mentioned, I was a civil engineer for about 10 years before going back to law school. And in that realm of civil engineering, I felt like I was primarily the only woman in the room at most of the meetings that I went to. And now that has definitely shifted in the kind of the type of law that I do now.
All right. And so as an engineer, obviously I had to look at some data. And so I found a few studies that evaluated the percentage of female expert witnesses. And granted, this is, it spans all different fields. But I wanted to see how it matched up with my personal experience. And these studies found generally a small percentage of female expert witnesses in the courtroom, ranging from 9% to 20%. Just as a comparison point, the American Bar Association found that female attorneys represent 41% of attorneys. And so I was hoping, Shireen, if you might walk us through one of these studies that has looked into the percentage of female experts.
Yes, absolutely. So I'll talk about a study which is called the ERE, the Expert Representative sorry, let me get this right. The Equal Representation for Expert Witnesses Survey of 2024, which is, the ERE is report stems out of the ERE Pledge, which is actually an initiative which started off prior to it being focused on experts. Particularly, there was a preceding pledge called the ERA, Equal Representation and Arbitration Pledge, which was focused on the number of women appointed as arbitrators, international arbitrators in arbitration matters, and the number of counsel that were female in these high-profile cases. And the numbers, of course, for arbitration representatives was quite low, of arbitrators was quite low as well. And so there was a concerted effort to make a difference in terms of how many, what the numbers showed and how many women were really being appointed or nominated to these various roles. And so the ERA pledge began something like over 30 years ago, and has had really a significant impact as counsel, as arbitrators, as institutions committed to actually, making a difference in their practices to ensure that there was greater representation of women in the field. The ERE pledge stemmed out of, this is the expert witnesses pledge, stemmed out of an initial survey which began assessing within the arbitration community, well, how many expert witnesses are there actually being appointed in these cases, that either appointed or nominated in these cases that are women. And unfortunately, the numbers initially were quite low. And so the pledge was founded as a kind of sister pledge to the ERA pledge as a means of combating that systemic problem within the industry. So what do the numbers say? Well, more than half of the respondents in the initial survey in 2020 indicated that they had not seen even one single female expert witness testify in the previous 3 years. So those numbers were quite dire. And then the pledge was formulated, and then subsequent studies were conducted in 2022 and 2023. And this report, I'll just go through some of the primary statistics. One is that more than half of the women were appointed or testified as a sole expert witness in only 9% of their cases. So in fact, our perception, my perception that I shared earlier, that I hadn't really seen very many female testifying experts, is actually reinforced by the data, which is showing that less than 10% of expert witnesses, based on the survey responses, are women. Only 21% of respondents said that a female expert was considered in more than half of their cases. So again, very low numbers. And the majority of experts which actually had been appointed with greater frequency were those who had been appointed more than 20 times. So once someone was appointed, initially, then they had the probability of actually being appointed multiple times in the future. So female experts appointed more than 20 times show that, once women are given the initial opportunity to take the expert witness role, they're being called on to do so again. And I'll just share one last statistic. 97% of female respondents regularly draft expert reports or play a major role in drafting them. So that number is very high. They're actively involved in the case and the generation of the reports compared, 97% compared to 93% of men, yet they are, very vastly underrepresented in the testifying role. I do just want to point out one other aspect of the report, which is a series of statements as to what female experts should do in order to increase their presence in these roles. Some of the respondents said that women needed to be more visible to instructing lawyers via their network, speaking opportunities, social media. Others said that they should make sure that their aspirations to be testifying experts are made known with the instructing lawyers. And another response was that experts should be asked to mentor each other, set up a formal mentoring scheme so experts with greater experience can pass on that knowledge to younger and aspiring lawyers. But that's not for lack of, wanting to hold these roles. I think the survey said something like 88% of the respondents, of the expert respondents, sought to have a role as a testifying expert in the future. So there is certainly that desire amongst the profession. So hopefully that gives you a flavor of what the statistics say, and I'll leave it there.
So thank you, Shireen. I'm glad to see that we're seeing maybe a change in some of these numbers. It's not quite so dire in recent years. But sort of one of the other questions that sort of follows from that is there sort of any difference in having a female versus male expert? And so there was a recently published article in the ABA, American Bar Association Journal, and it's linked to on this webinar, so you can take a look at it. And they did a series of mock trials using different female experts and male experts and female attorneys and male attorneys. And ultimately, fortunately, they found no bias in the outcome of the mock trial based on the gender of the witness. But one of the things that was interesting out of this study was that they did survey the mock jury to see whether they felt that there should be more females or more males. And ultimately, there was quite a desire in the jury for sort of more equal gender distribution among experts. And this was true for both the men and the women, obviously a little bit more for the women than for the men. But certainly the mock jury did desire to see more equal representation. And so, Shannon, I know that you've worked on a number of trials, and I know that you've surveyed juries after trials. And so I'm curious to see what your experience has been in light of this mock jury results.
Yeah. Thank you. I think, in my experience, after a jury trial concludes, the attorneys often have an opportunity to chat with the jurors. And sometimes jurors are willing to be interviewed at length. And so we often take that opportunity to really understand what worked for the jury, what didn't work, to understand which experts resonated the most with the jurors, and for what reasons, which experts they found to be sort of most influential in their decisions, and that type of thing. And I would say, in my experience, which I should note is largely limited to trials in San Francisco. So it's, the geography and the jury pool here in San Francisco might be different than in other places. But I would say that my personal experience sort of mirrors that of the ABA study. I don't think that we see really any explicit biases between male and female expert witnesses. And, oftentimes what jurors are most focused on is sort of a set of criteria in experts that, in my opinion, doesn't necessarily inherently, identify as either male or female. And so, first and foremost, I think jurors are looking for expert witnesses who are qualified and credible. That's going to be something that, is super important. And I don't think, gender has any role in that, in determining, whether an expert is qualified or credible. The second one I think is really big, and I think it's probably very unique to jury trials. And this is sort of the extent to which an expert can engage the jury, and the jury will walk away with a sort of memory of this particular expert, that will later enter into their minds when they're deliberating in the jury room. And this, you sort of have to think about the context of the whole trial. Oftentimes I'm trying cases that take 6 weeks. And so these poor jurors, and I'm on the defense side for the most part. And so these poor jurors are sitting through weeks and weeks and weeks of testimony. By the time the defense gets to go, 3 to 4 weeks into trial, the jury is pretty tired. They're exhausted from listening to experts, and other witnesses talk at them all day. And so it's super important that you have an expert who can be engaging and really connect with the jury, because they're not going to remember a thing that the expert says unless they're really, really engaged. And so, that these two characteristics, I think, sort of really come down to an individual, the individual's, qualifications, but also sort of personality and their ability to come alive on the stand. And I think, ensuring that you, as an attorney, ensuring that you are considering the entire pool of experts, including all of the qualified female experts out there, is super critical, because, you really want to find the person who's going to most connect with your jury. And that person very well might be a woman, and it might be a man, but it's most important to consider sort of the whole pool. So I would say there's not really an explicit gender bias that we've seen, but to echo the second sort of part of the study, in a number of my cases, I am among several other female attorneys on the attorney team, and we have numerous female experts on our expert roster, and we've been up against the plaintiff's side, that includes only male attorneys and only male experts. And that is something notable that the jury picks up on, right? It's something, whether that actually plays into their decision, I'm not sure, but they really appreciate the fact that, our side is more sort of equally representative of what the jury pool looks like and what the population looks like. And so I think, whether it plays into sort of any type of explicit gender bias, I can't really say that I've noticed that, but it is something that jurors notice, when you have a more diverse attorney and expert profile.
Thank you for that perspective, Shannon. Shireen, did you have any additional thoughts on that?
Excuse me. Yes. So my I have some particular thoughts with respect to the decision making that goes into determining whether someone, one person or another, should be the chosen expert witness in a given matter. I've found, and I think the same is true for the appointment of arbitrators and the appointment of even either legal experts or subject matter experts on particular issues, it's generally a challenge to obtain greater diversity as the ball is being passed between the client and the lawyer teams. So oftentimes, what do I mean by that? The lawyer team may say, oh, we'd love to appoint more gender diverse or, other types of diversity, racial diversity or others, more diverse individuals as our testifying expert, but the client has reservations. Or you would hear oftentimes from the client perspective, individuals and in-house counsel teams would say, oh, we'd love to do that. We have a particular protocol with respect to greater diversity. However, our lawyer teams are reluctant to do so. There's a kind of passing the ball. With arbitrations, institutions are also kind of thrown into the mix because sometimes they may appoint members of the the key actors in an arbitration. So the question, resulting question is, well, who bears responsibility for ensuring greater diversity, for moving to that next step of greater representation in these various roles? And, I think at some point, someone just has to take responsibility. In the arbitration world, it's really been the institutions that have taken the lead and saying that, you know what, we're going to publish statistics annually to show our progress on making appointments that have greater gender balance or greater racial diversity or geographic diversity balance. We're going to, ensure that we are holding individuals accountable. We're holding other arbitrators accountable when they're considering the appointment of their chairperson, for instance, or we're holding parties accountable for appointments of experts and so on. And I think by having that accountability and transparency in the process, you have the ability to really affect significant impact upon who those choices are, who are those individuals that are being chosen, and considering that as, of course, not I don't want to say that the least qualified person should be appointed just because they're diverse, but really, amongst equally qualified individuals seeking to ensure that we have greater gender and racial diversity in our appointments. So I'll just add one last point, which is that I think that we have, particularly with respect to experts, subject matter expertise is really a very important consideration. And I saw a comment in the chat about, when someone doesn't necessarily have experience, it's difficult to ensure that they are actually appointed in a particular role. Experience is, something that, of course, is essential from a client perspective or from a counsel perspective in ensuring that risk is diminished in terms of who you're appointing, in terms of the expert. You want the most qualified individual. You want the one that is going to be best fit to your case, the one most familiar with the subject matter, the one that has a good track record on the issues present in your case. So if you can show that in a variety of different means and maybe some creative means, maybe not the most traditional ways of assessing, experience or qualifications, that can contribute to ensuring greater diversity. So creating that comfort through other means, I think, is part of the process for diversifying the pool.
Thank you, Shireen. That's a really interesting perspective. In light of what Shannon indicated and what the studies have indicated, that there's really, there's no bias, but there's still sort of a question in the back of our mind, is there any reason why you would want to hire a female expert? There was one study that I looked at. It was for psychology experts, so a little bit different from environmental, but that study did find that female expert witnesses were more likable. And so I was wondering, from just, translating this into the environmental realm, is there any reason why you'd want to hire a female expert? Are there any sort of traditionally female attributes that might be helpful in your line of work? And so, Joey, if you had any thoughts there, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I don't know that I would characterize them as traditionally female attributes. I think the attributes that I look for in someone that I'm going to hire or recommend that my client hire as the technical consultant or the expert is really that they kind of, as Shireen said, they are the expert and they know what they're doing. They're credible. I'd like to go to an expert who will tell me that my client actually has a problem here and needs to fix it. I don't want an expert who is just going to, tell me what I want to hear to have the best case. So I think that's a really big one, credibility. And then, in terms of things that I'm looking for is really clear technical writing. So in that first phase of the project, a technical report that's laid out with here are all the facts and the data that I can use, and then the analysis to support a really clear conclusion. And I think that's something that I started appreciating more as I became a lawyer, just the value of really clear and concise and precise technical writing. And I think any expert, and I'm seeing also in the chat, what Shireen was mentioning, anyone who wants to start to become an expert, but doesn't have that testifying experience yet, becoming really good at writing that report and showing that you can come to a clear conclusion so that when, Shannon asks you in a deposition, is this X or Y? You can say it is Y because of these 5 things. So that I think is a way to start getting your foot in the door. The other piece is building a really solid resume. And that's not just testifying experience. It can be, writing papers, giving talks at conferences, guest lecturing at, university or college classes. Anything that shows that you're that technical matter expert helps in getting someone in the door as that expert. And then I think the other thing that most people are looking for in my realm and probably in Shannon and Shireen's is really confident speaking style. Having your conclusion, sticking to it, and not waffling as you speak. And I think that's a really important thing and something that people can practice as you're starting to do that and show that to prospective clients by giving presentations and just telling people that you've done that. And I think the last attribute that I think is really important in any realm, jury and in the city council, is really reading the room and figuring out how you're going to present the data to, if it's a jury, or in my case, it's often political decision makers and neighborhood groups, and just being able to present it in a way that resonates with those people is really important. And I think that I've seen men do it really well, and I've seen women do it really well. And so I don't know that it's really a male or female attribute, but those are kind of the main things that I think are important.
Awesome, thank you. Shannon, what has been your experience in the litigation realm? Are there any sort of traditional female attributes you look for or not?
I would kind of echo what Joey said. I don't think there are any sort of inherently female versus male attributes that we look for specifically in experts. And in my experience, both men and women really equally have the types of attributes that we're looking for. And I think I mentioned earlier, particularly in a jury trial setting, an expert's ability to engage with the jury, their sort of memorability with the jury is pretty critical. And Joey mentioned clear and concise communication, in drafting expert reports. In the litigation realm, it sort of depends on whether you're in federal or state court and to what extent you're going to be relying on a written report. But we always know that at the end of the day, our expert is going to be in front of a panel of 12 to 18 jurors. And so their oral communication skills are extremely critical. And so that's kind of one of the most important attributes that we are filtering for. We need an expert who can communicate with lay people. And sometimes you know, sometimes the people on the jury have degrees in, you know, a relatively similar field, or, you know, some type of work experience, or, you know, whatever it is, and they can sort of understand things at a more technical level. But a lot of times you have jurors that don't have any experience whatsoever with the topic at hand. And so you really need an expert who can communicate really complicated, complex issues to people who, you know, don't have, you know, sort of that expert vernacular at their fingertips, right? So that's going to be, it's really going to be a person by person evaluation. And then I would just say, you know, sort of along the lines of an expert's memorability with a jury, it can go, you know, one of two ways, right? And, you know, an expert's ability to very gracefully and confidently deal with cross-examination where their particular opinions are being challenged, you know, sometimes in a really aggressive way, right? Sometimes you will have an opposing counsel who is, you know, extremely aggressive, and, you know, it's, sometimes that works in front of the jury, sometimes it doesn't, but, you know, you need your expert to keep their cool no matter what, and be able to, you know, to continue communicating in clear terms, you know, why the opposing counsel is wrong about, you know, whatever they're suggesting, you know, and why your opinion sort of takes the day. And so I've seen an equal number of men and women get super defensive on the stand, you know, when their opinions are questioned. And juries will remember that probably more than anything. I think part of it is just the drama, and they, you know, that sort of like piques their attention, but, you know, it's not the type of memory that you really want. And it doesn't often work with a jury, right? They view defensiveness as sort of a weakness and a vulnerability. And so that's another thing that I think, another attribute that we sort of have to screen for. But it's certainly not an inherently male or female characteristic. And you know, I've seen, like I said, I've seen both men and women become super defensive on the stand, and it never ends well. But I think those are sort of the characteristics that are most important for litigation.
Thank you, Shannon. I can certainly speak to, it's very difficult to not get defensive when all your opinions are being challenged. So I understand. It's always hard to remain cool. But Shireen, what has been your experience in the arbitration realm, whether you see any sort of traditionally female attributes that are helpful or not?
Yeah, I would agree with both Joey and Shannon that I don't, well, number one, don't think that there are, you know, typically female attributes. I don't like to say that any are really inherent to women versus men. I mean, it really is a you know, a comparison of personalities and you know, strengths and weaknesses in terms of the delivery and assertiveness of a person. And so my rule personally, I think the rule of many of our counsel teams has been really to search for the best candidate from a substantive perspective, from a delivery perspective, and then from a ability to engage and respond to critique of their positions. And that's been a useful criteria, I think an accurate criteria for being able to assess whether an expert will perform well under the intense pressure. And I mean, I want to go back to one point that Joey mentioned, which was delivery, because I think delivery, whether that's vis-a-vis counsel, whether it's in a, you know, an initial interview with counsel, or whether it's later, you know, before a client or directly, before the tribunal during testimony or even presentation of an expert report. All of those circumstances necessitate a type of delivery that really does need to inspire confidence in the expert. And to the extent that an expert is able to present things in that manner, I think they really have a chance of great success in all of those contexts. And the places where I've seen actually members of an expert's team really excel is in all of those behind the scenes settings where the team members, who may often be more frequently female, are able to deliver with that level of assertiveness and clarity the responses and confidence that are needed in order to put forth the response that gives confidence to the position in a way that might be put in doubt or questioned. And so to the extent there's a member of the team that's able to do that, that definitely catches my attention as counsel is, oh, this person might not have testified before, but they might be, really quite comfortable with the material and able to be comfortable in that setting. I've also seen in arbitration, because the setting is somewhat different in the sense that it's more of a less adversarial environment, more collaborative to a certain extent, although that's being questioned nowadays and definitely becoming more adversarial. But generally, the expert is not only meant to provide their report and their findings and then stand by them or defend them in the context of a hearing, but the experts are also meant to be helpful to the arbitrators, to the arbitral panel, arbitral tribunal. And that characteristic I found is, to the extent that a testifying expert can play that role in, number one, just being assertive and standing strong behind their findings, answering questions, dealing with criticism calmly and carefully, not getting flustered by cross-examination, but then also playing that role of being comforting and supportive and servile in the sense that, they're giving the arbitral tribunal comfort in, persuading them to take their position, I think has been, particularly in the arbitration field, a trait which is quite useful and really one of the marks of a successful expert witness.
So, wow, we have a lengthy list of attributes that a good expert should have, ability to connect with the audience, ability to survive a deposition, excellent technical writing, confident speaking ability, reading the room, communicating well with lay people, no defensiveness on the stand, assertiveness, and helpfulness with the arbitrator or, finder of fact. And so that's a lot. That sounds like a big hurdle to overcome. But the fact that we see still few female expert witnesses, although that may be changing, I just want to discuss maybe what are some of those hurdles for getting hired as an expert. And so Joey, could you also, because you have been an expert witness previously, what are some of those hurdles that you've seen to get hired?
So I think some of the hurdles, and people in the chat, and I think actually you alluded to it at the beginning, Kristen, is really just experience. So I was a civil engineer for 10 years. And I think when I decided to make the switch to law, I was just getting into the point where I was being deposed and had enough experience to even get into that realm of becoming the expert and not just a support role. So I think some of it is just sticking it out and being there long enough. I think it's very hard to be a subject matter expert. And I'm curious on Shannon and Shireen's thoughts on this, testifying, even if you have, I had a master's degree, but even if you have a PhD and, 5 years experience, I don't know that that's enough necessarily to be the expert in front of, a tribunal. It can be, but I think a lot of it is just getting that experience. And I think another hurdle is really kind of all those attributes that you talked about, Kristen. I didn't learn how to do any of those things when I was in university as a civil engineer. We maybe gave 1 or 2 presentations as part of, defending a dissertation. Writing classes, there weren't any writing classes. I barely wrote any papers. It was, the laws that we it was problem sets. And so I think making that transition from, and I think Shannon, you described it as, you have to be able to explain these really complicated technical areas that you are an expert in to someone who just doesn't know that area. And it's not something that engineers or scientists are necessarily, or at least they weren't when I was trained as an engineer. It wasn't something that was focused on. And I think it's really important that people who want to become experts take the time, which, I think someone mentioned in the chat, it's not billable time, but take the time to maybe take a public speaking class or do more writing, blog posts, things where you need to be able to explain those complicated technical matters to other people. One thing that I actually did was go into my kids' schools and try to explain one of the projects I was working on to a group of 4-year-olds. And it made me, and I realize the jurors are not 4-year-olds, but it made me kind of take it down to the basic level and kind of distill what are the key important points. And so I think that's a hurdle that not every, I don't want to generalize, there are some technical consultants who are already very good at this, but that was a big hurdle for me, was just figuring out how to communicate effectively.
I'll just jump in and say,
Oh, please, Shannon. Yeah.
sometimes jurors are like 4-year-olds. And I personally, as an attorney, I don't have, a scientific background in any of this. So I'm often a good gauge for this, right? I tell an expert, okay, explain it to me. I need to be able to understand this, as somebody who has no experience in this. So that's a good gauge, to really be able to bring it down to the most fundamental basic points.
And I certainly have found, in my expert role where I'm continually speaking with attorneys, having to switch language from uber technical to, okay, I can't use all those technical terms because people don't understand those. So how would I explain it? And I also, Joey, I echo your statement that kids are very helpful because if they understand it, then anyone can.
Mm-hmm.
But Shireen, I wanted to switch over to you and see what has been your experience in what are those hurdles for women, and also what did the ERE or ERA survey identify as hurdles to get those testifying roles?
Yeah, I would just add, thank you. I would add that in addition to four-year-olds, very sophisticated law students are also a good place to test out your skills in that respect. So if you have the opportunity to be an adjunct professor or deliver a guest lecture, those are also good for being able to not only deliver but also field the questions, very sophisticated questions that come at you from those knowledgeable students. But in response to your question, let me start by sharing some of the reasons which were cited in the ERE pledge for the reason why respondents felt that more male experts were being appointed than female experts. So one was that lawyers had a preference to use experts which they knew or previously used. That was the primary response. The second was that there was a lack of women reaching sufficiently senior levels in their own profession. So, challenges in terms of the pipeline within expert witness firms or in expert witness roles. The third was lack of experience in an expert witness role. I know this came up earlier in the chat, but if you don't have an experience as a testifying expert, perhaps that's a barrier. And then a lack of encouragement or promotion by own colleagues was fourth. Fifth was lack of awareness of the issue of those involved in appointing expert witnesses. I guess speaking there to the lack of female representation, just not being aware of that issue or not being synthesized to it. And then actual or perceived lack of gravitas, actual or perceived lack of confidence. So those go to some of the points we mentioned earlier in terms of delivery. And then preference of some women to remain in a support role, or lack of gender data collected, lack of competence. So those are the reasons which were cited in the survey. In my experience, I think, the primary barrier for me as counsel in seeking, because I certainly have the desire to appoint female experts that are qualified and, equally qualified as their male counterparts who could do, an equally good job in many of these cases. The challenges for me have been, number one, lack of subject matter expertise that's specific to a particular case. So someone might have, general testifying experience. They might have a general familiarity with the field, but not like the very specific angle, substantive angle, that is relevant for a particular case. So it's difficult to sell their capabilities really to the client and to get buy-in for moving forward with that expert witness. Inversely, I've had the opportunity to actually successfully appoint female experts with no issue whatsoever, no pushback from the client, where they did have that demonstrated experience. They really had multiple testifying experience on those particular topics, maybe not in arbitration, but maybe in litigation and other fields, or they had written expert reports or done even private or confidential expert assessments, which can be displayed on a CV in a way that preserves confidentiality. So that's maybe one way of kind of creating greater experience where it might not necessarily be a testifying expert role. Another challenge has been where someone might have really good substantive expertise, but they have zero testifying expert experience. That's really the primary hurdle, I would say, for us as counsel is, you don't know how someone will perform under that pressure. It is such a very specific experience, and someone needs to, an expert needs to be able to act well under those circumstances. And to the extent they have not yet had that experience, it's very difficult to say, okay, someone should indeed take on that role. And I think there's a few ways of getting around it, but they need to be sufficiently robust so that you would feel confident kind of deviating from that standard rule of thumb. One way is like what I was speaking to earlier, that just assertive way of speaking, clear, confident familiarity with the material, with the circumstances. I've actually had an instance where a male testifying expert was the one who was initially chosen, and then because of challenges, they were unable to actually testify, and then a female member of the support team was actually brought in to be the testifying expert. Or I've had another instance where a female member of a team was brought on to be a co-testifying expert, where they sat alongside the male expert. And that's meant to kind of give them that experience without the pressure of, fully having to deal with the most challenging questions that might come forth. So I think it's, you can be a little bit creative, but of course you want to inspire confidence. You can do that, through some of these alternative means. You could do extensive mock, preparation of mock cross-examination and a preparation for cross-examination. That sometimes helps. In the arbitration setting, what's also important is delivery of the expert report. So oftentimes you have direct testimony in the form of a presentation. And so that often carries like quite a bit of weight, sometimes even more so than the cross, because it's the first kind of oral exposure to the material in the expert report, sometimes which, the arbitrators may not have read in full. And that perception of the expert in that role is really important for how the material is being perceived then later on during cross-examination and during questioning. And arbitrators may ask questions during those presentations. So all of those circumstances I think are pretty important. Speaking roles as well, and papers. Although someone in the chat did make a good comment that publishing may create a track record which can have potentially negative implications in the future to the extent it goes against the position you're seeking to defend. So it is, of course, a balance in terms of, you don't want to publish anything. You do want something of substance, and perhaps something, that takes into account the position that you're most likely to take on some of these matters. So I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to continue the discussion.
Thank you, Shireen. So we've talked about all these hurdles and all the characteristics. So do you try, I think I can infer the answer here, but do you try specifically to hire female expert witnesses? And Shannon, I'll start with you.
I wouldn't say that I try to hire female expert witnesses, but I do try to consider female expert witnesses. And really that just means I'm trying to consider, the whole sort of pool of qualified expert witnesses for a particular role. And making sure that I'm not excluding anybody, just because they haven't testified 200 times, or, been working in a particular role for 30 plus years. So I'm making sure that I'm considering, qualifications in a broader sense. And, I think that often ensures that women are part of that pool that we're considering for particular roles.
Thank you. And Joey, you already indicated that in your line of work, you do have a lot of female experts that you work with, but do you try specifically to hire them, or are you more neutral?
I think really similar to Shannon's answer on this, it's, looking at the whole pool and figuring out, who is the best person for this. And, for the land use work that I do, often it's, a consultant who has already worked in that jurisdiction and maybe has political connections, or, knows that specific jurisdiction really well. And so just making sure that the pool includes all people, I think is really important.
And Shireen, going to you, and you had talked earlier about this arbitration pledge, where arbitrators are really trying to advance the careers of women. What are your thoughts about whether you specifically try to hire female experts?
Yeah, I mean, my response is that generally I will really strive to choose the best person for the position. I will never let seeking a lesser qualified candidate be the reason for appointing someone diverse. However, what I do want to do and actively try to do in my practice is to remove artificial barriers that really are imposed by bias or outright discrimination. And so to the extent that that exists, which I think the research confirms, there must be something behind, the fact that there are such disproportions. Certainly in the arbitration space, it is due to, the lack of women as arbitrators is, there has been research done showing that it is in part due to bias and perception of female arbitrators as in some instances perceived as less qualified. There is some job needed to rectify that imbalance. And so my philosophy on that is, not compromising quality, not compromising qualifications or best fit for the position. But to the extent there are, barriers, I do want to seek to remove those barriers and consider, or at least put before my client for consideration, equally qualified individuals who do have those qualifications. So that's how I view it.
And you talked earlier when you were listing all the hurdles for women becoming testifiers. One of them is they've never testified before.
Mhm.
And so you were talking earlier about how you try to remove hurdles or misconceptions or arbitrariness. Do you try to push for that first expert role for women? I can certainly speak to my personal experience that I am very grateful for that first attorney who hired me as an expert. I mean, I had been working in a consulting role on this small matter involving baking soda, used to remove paint off the outside of a house, which is kind of a weird area of expertise for sure. But and so I was just wanting to ask you whether you folks push for women who are, obviously highly qualified, have all the attributes that you're looking for. Do you push for your clients to hire them in their first testifying role.
Yeah, and I mean, I do think that to the extent there is someone who really is a shining star, who's bright, who is doing a great job behind the scenes and has demonstrated that to the counsel team, to the client, in preparation, then that it's really a no-brainer. It's not something that I need to actively advocate for, but it's pretty, remarkable, and people take note of that for future opportunities. And so I've had a few instances where not by, me particularly pushing for that, but just the general perception based on multiple times working with someone, perhaps in a non-testifying context, where someone is just clearly cut out for the role and someone who we take note of and come back to in the future as someone we might consider, even though they don't have testifying experience. So it's not kind of arbitrarily pushing for giving those experiences to people who might not have the right attributes. I think it's cultivating those where they do exist and promoting those individuals, and giving them the face time that they need in order to be successful.
Thank you. And Shannon, could you speak to your experience and whether you've tried to push for these first roles for women as testifiers?
Yeah. I think, in my experience, you know, it's often not desirable to hire an expert witness who has testified 200, 300 plus times, whatever it may be. It's not desirable to hire the expert in a particular area, somebody who's super well known. And oftentimes that ends up being a man. But, I think from a litigation perspective, experts who have a ton of testifying experience and have been at the sort of litigation game for many years, are really hard to coach. They're really difficult. They're very set in their ways in terms of how they testify and how they operate. And so they're less inclined to take direction. They're less inclined to take advice. And so I always sort of think those types of people, whatever you hire is exactly what you're going to get, right? You can't hire someone like that and expect, maybe we might be able to tweak a few things, and improve a few things down the road. And so oftentimes I'm actually seeking out people who have, certainly a lot of experience and credibility in the particular subject matter, but people who don't necessarily have a ton of testifying experience. And it didn't happen to be a woman, but it happened to be a man. But in a recent case, I really pushed the client to hire a gentleman who had never testified before, and never been involved in litigation at all. He was a California regulator for over 30 years. And it just so happened that he had this really sort of unique skill set when it came to, the regulatory framework of, this particular area that we were litigating. And, it took some convincing from the client perspective, because I think a lot of times clients are more hesitant to hire folks that don't have testifying experience because they understand it's going to cost maybe a little bit more to get that person ready, right? You're going to have to plan more preparation sessions and more mock sessions with that person so that they're, more prepared for the sort of adversarial nature of a deposition and cross-examination at trial. But, if you're really, to Shireen's point, if you're really identifying a person with a unique skill set, and a person who's super qualified, it isn't always a hard sell to the client. It might take a little bit more prep time on the front end. It might take a little bit more coaching, but the end result is going to be, really phenomenal. And in this particular case, we probably had 8 or 9 other experts in the case. And this one guy who had no testifying experience at all ended up being the star. And, you know, it was actually a bench trial, so it wasn't before a jury, but his testimony ended up being the single most important testimony in the entire case. And so for the client, that, you know, that obviously really paid off. And so I think it's, you know, from my perspective, more and more, I'm really looking for somebody who has the experience and who can sort of grow into a great testifier, not somebody who necessarily, you know, has a ton of testifying experience and, you know, is really set in their testifying ways, if that makes sense.
Kristen, could I
Thank
add
you for
just
that.
one final two-liner on the fact that, you know, sometimes we do have different types of cases, obviously. And so some cases are those like huge, massive cases where there's a lot on the line, and you know, you might not want to take a chance with someone who might not have as much experience or comfort in those roles. There are, of course, smaller cases or you know, other opportunities for FaceTime, whether that's, you know, doing a presentation before a client on a particular issue or to the counsel team. And so there are other ways in which you can facilitate kind of growing the pipeline and expanding experience, particularly among younger lawyers or lawyers of color or, you know, women that might not have had those opportunities previously, that can be done without kind of compromising on those, you know, big ticket cases where you need to show someone who has that demonstrated testifying experience kind of over a series of different cases. So I would just say we can think creatively about some of those other opportunities and kind of building experience incrementally through a series of you know, exposure of a particular individual to those skills.
And I can certainly speak from my personal experience. My first testifying opportunity was on a very small matter. And so that certainly, I think it, you know, helped the client take a chance on me, but it also helped me because it was a very small matter. What I was testifying to was very small. And so it just made it easier of a hurdle, I think, on both sides to overcome that issue. You know, had I had to testify for the first time on a huge, massive matter with tons of data, it would have been far more terrifying than it already was. And so, Joey, I wanted to end with you because you've, again, been on both sides of this. And so do you try to hire a female testifier for the first time to overcome one of the major hurdles, especially since someone took a chance on you when you were a testifier?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about it. And I don't know, kind of similar to Shannon and Shireen, I don't know that I actively look for a woman to try to get that first testifying experience. I think I do. I have, and I can think of a number of occasions where I've noticed that, you know, there's a team of people working and it's maybe a male, sometimes a female, but male who is, you know, the person who is the face and the person who will stand up and testify, but there's a whole team of people who actually know all of the details and have done all of the work. And a number of times I have advocated for the person who actually has done all the work and knows all the data and can, you know, without thinking about it and without having to get a Post-it note sent to them, know exactly what the answer is to every question. And so I think when I recognize that there's that person on a team, I definitely advocate for them to be the one who's up on, you know, up at the podium, answering the questions at the city council hearing or the planning commission meeting, because they can answer with kind of all of those attributes that we talked about earlier. They're confident, they know all the details, they're able to answer any follow-up questions on it. And I think once you start doing that, so you become that member of the team who shows the client and the client team that actually you're the one who did all the work and you know this case backwards and forwards, then you will start becoming the one who people want testifying in whatever tribunal it's in.
Thank you so much. I think we should switch to some of the questions from the audience. We've received quite a few. The first one is, what are you seeing by way of female expert witnesses of color, which is something we certainly didn't address in this. If anyone wants to take a first stab at that, go ahead.
I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I like if I haven't seen a lot of female experts, I certainly have not seen a lot of female experts of color, and that's a huge problem. And but you know, I don't know what the demographics look like in terms of women who are graduating from these various fields who have the you know kind of the educational training to take on these roles. We certainly should be paying equal attention to these issues, and it's definitely something that I try to do in practice as well with the same types of criteria. But I think the, you know, mentorship, creating those opportunities behind the scenes, the ones, you know, Kristen alluded to, Joey and Shannon as well, and cultivating the next generation of qualified women, including women of color, is really essential for allowing for the pool to expand, and that really needs to be done by facilitating that skill building from the most earliest point in career to when they actually get testifying experiences.
As an engineer and working as an engineering firm, the pool is small.
Yeah.
I can definitely tell you that. I mean, you know, we have a lot of women. There are very few women of color, and that's just. There are quite a few men of color, but the female pool, it just gets smaller and smaller. Shannon or Joey, if you had anything to add on that.
I think that's my experience as well. I will say, you know, in one of my cases, we have two women of color who are expert witnesses. And I think this may sort of depend on the field, the particular field. So one is in epidemiology. And another one is in city planning. And so, you know, it may be sort of, it may be part and parcel of sort of the pipeline of individuals, you know, graduating in a particular area of expertise. But yeah, many fewer women of color, I think, than women in general.
And this may like necessitate the need to view geographic diversity in a different way, because certainly in different countries around the world, there are, you know, very qualified women of color in and graduating at very high rates from these various degrees in particular countries. So I know in international arbitration, there's certainly been a push for greater geographic diversity in addition to racial diversity as a means of, you know, increasing and diversifying representation.
Joey, did you have anything to add?
I was going to echo. It is definitely less. There are, as Shannon said, there are some women of color that I work with, but it's less for sure.
Another question is about what are thoughts on publishing? Is it important to publish or post lots of subject matter publications? But there was concern about how those can be used against you by opposing counsel. And so any thoughts on whether it's worth spending non-billable time after work to try to publish, or whether there's too much potentially at play against you in a testifying role?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. I mean, I think there is a sort of perception that, you know, somebody whose CV, you know, has 40 pages of listed publications, you know, is that person is somehow more qualified. But what I found is that even, you know, when a person has a ton of publications, oftentimes, you know, only maybe one or two of those publications is even, you know, tangentially relevant to the issue they're testifying about. And so it's not something you know, I am super focused on in hiring an expert. But to the extent, you know, that you're developing an expertise, you know, in a particular class of chemicals, for instance, in a particular space, then, you know, I mean, it can be a way to sort of develop that expertise and demonstrate that expertise. In terms of, it's very much something that opposing counsel will hone in on. And I've done it as an opposing counsel. You're looking for sort of easy sound bites, where you can identify a perspective that, is potentially contradictory to a position you're taking in litigation, or, just somehow sort of cast doubt on a witness's credibility. I think that's always going to happen. And so, it's more really about your ability to sort of handle those questions in a litigation setting, by opposing counsel, whether it's deposition or in front of a jury. I would say, depending on sort of the funding for the article, or the research, or, if it's a talk, the funding for the talk, that's also something that can be potentially more damaging. We had one one expert witness in our cases that did a ton of work with the American Petroleum Institute. And, he hadn't done a ton of work for Chevron and Exxon and, these big oil companies, but a number of the papers that he had worked on and a number of the talks he had given, were sort of facilitated by API, and that was used as sort of a basis to challenge his credibility. So I would think about sort of ensuring that you have kind of a balanced platform, whether it's sponsorship or funding, for any of this stuff, or just perspectives. I think that often adds more to your credibility in a litigation perspective.
Joey or Shireen, anything to add to that question about publications?
I think I would just add quick thing is, as you're starting out as an expert, if kind of, as Shannon mentioned, if there's a particular issue or chemical that you want to focus your practice on, developing that expertise and showing that you have it through publications. And maybe it's, at conferences where you're not sponsored by someone, it's, purely a research type. I know that's hard when you're working in the consulting world to figure out how to do that. But maybe it's, partnering with someone at a university and, getting your name associated with papers that way. I think it does. I felt like when I was an expert, that was something that helped as I was starting out.
One other trick that I can say just personally, to make sure that a paper doesn't get used against you, is to keep it focused. Like, this site, we observed this scientifically, so that it's harder to take those same exact conclusions and necessarily force them to any site or any particular situation. So keeping it hyper focused, and then also being very careful in your language and how you write those and how you write up your conclusions. Make sure there's absolutely no speculation or no sort of broadening to the universal world at large, so that it you can always fall back on the statement that, no, this was focused on this site or this particular, very narrow area, and so you can't necessarily translate those conclusions to anything else.
Yeah.
You need to be very careful whether, or site specifically evaluate whether you can translate those conclusions. So one trick of publishing, but then walking that fine line of not having it used against you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Kristen. I would just say from the perspective of preparing cross-examination, you can tell when an expert has done exactly what you've said, because it becomes very difficult to then pull out statements or positions to then reuse them in a cross-examination context. So I would say that's a really effective way of getting your name out there, while at the same time protecting yourself in the event that you have to testify on that topic.
So one other question that we had is about implicit bias in assessing expert testifiers, and really going into the confidence in a presentation, because sort of going back to sort of those female characteristics, there's maybe a intersection between confidence and aggressiveness, or a fine line between confidence and aggressiveness. And so if you could speak to that, and so how do you sort of walk that fine line of being confident and authoritative, but not aggressive? If anyone wants to take the lead on that.
I saw
It's a tricky
Shannon.
one.
It's so tricky. I saw Shannon nodding. I feel like she's got some thoughts.
I mean, it's a really tough one, right? Because
It's really hard.
yeah, it's really hard. And I mean, I see it all the time, and actually there's nothing I dislike more than an aggressive, arrogant expert witness. I mean, and frankly, I think that in my experience, arrogant, sort of overconfident expert witnesses tend to be the ones who have, many, many, many years of testifying experience. They're the ones who don't take direction. They're the ones who don't, who aren't willing to learn and adjust their style. And they're also the ones that tend to be defensive. And so, I mean, it is really tough, but for me, I think it always comes down to sort of looking at an expert's core set of qualifications and their core set of experience, and whether that's, and I mean, for me, like I mentioned, hiring this one particular expert who had zero testifying experience at all, but he worked at this regulatory agency for 30 years and was the most knowledgeable person about, how to apply these particular regulations and how the agency had applied to these regulations historically and things like that. So that person was the most qualified, and, and the next step was sort of identifying, okay, this person's we're going to be able to get there with this person. We're going to be able to put the work in with this person to get him to the point of being able to confidently communicate to the jury or to the judge in a way that resonates, and is super credible, right? But and it's our job, I think, as attorneys to sort of advocate for that with clients who might not otherwise be inclined to spend the extra money on preparing a witness and really coaching a witness to get them ready to testify. But I think, if that person is your most qualified person, that's really going to, I think, be the ultimate decision maker. So it's a little bit of a roundabout way of saying that, I think these sort of these confidence and presentation issues are real for sure. But I find that people who have a ton of experience in their field, and they've been at something for 10, 15, 20 years, sort of that background experience is going to give them the confidence that they need to develop into a good testifying expert witness. Even if they don't have the experience, that can be developed because they know the material backwards, forwards, sideways, any way you present it to them. And so that's really the most important thing when I'm looking for an expert witness.
Yeah, I know we're pretty much out of time. I just wanted to add that I think the confidence comes from knowing the material backwards and forwards, presenting it with if you know the material backwards and forwards, you can present confidently. And then you can practice, being able to deliver it with confidence. But I think there is a way to, as women, present things with confidence and not come off aggressively. But I think it's hard, and I think it takes some practice.
Yeah, and I just want to add that, you may have, there's this inherent bias certainly exists, and that is certainly the response that's given not only to women, but often to women of color in particular. And so I don't want to negate that experience because I think it is a real thing. I think the way to deal with it, because this is such a performance-based role and a kind of perception-based role, taking the the feedback and the criticism and critique, which may in some instances be due to bias, but also considering kind of what tweaks can be made in delivery, what tweaks can be made in terms of presentation in a way that makes you just really foolproof as potential expert. So kind of treating the two, you know, calling out bias where it is occurring, but at the same time thinking about strengthening your capabilities across the board to be able to present in a way that's being perceived in a way that's effective for the role that you're undertaking.
All right, well, thank you so much to everyone for our fantastic speakers. I thought this was a really, really interesting conversation to have. So thank you so much. And I know there's studies that we cited to that are posted on the website. You're welcome to look at those. And if you need to reach us for any further questions, that information is also readily available. Thank you.
A huge thank you to our fabulous speakers today. Thank you to Kristen for moderating and to our panelists, Shireen, Joey, and Shannon. We so appreciate everyone taking the time to join us to discuss this important topic. Thank you as well to our audience for tuning in. As we said at the beginning of the webinar, this program was recorded and the recording will be posted to ELI's website within a few business days for members to view later. We will have another WELL program this fall, so keep an eye on the ELI events webpage in the coming weeks in order to register for that. For more information on WELL, please check out the links in the chat. Programs like these are made possible with the support of ELI members. Members can attend exclusive member webinars and have access to our entire webinar archive, along with many other resources. If you're not already a member, we encourage you to visit eli.org to join. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.